Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to our webinar today, where I'm going to be talking to you about preventing psychological injuries, specifically around, what happens in organizations around bullying and harassment, and what are the things that you can do to try and minimize the likelihood that a psychological injury will come about as a result of people perceiving a sense of, being bullied or harassed. And it's something, if you saw the live stream last week, I kind of alluded to some of the things that we will be talking about today, but I just wanted to have a bit more of an in-depth conversation about some of the things that we need to kind of put in place to make sure that we've covered off on some of the, standard things that tend to cause psychological injuries, specifically around bullying and harassment. So if you've been following the things that I've been talking about this year, you would have seen quite a bit about change management, because we know that that's one of the biggest issues, right? So what I want you to do, if you wouldn't mind, please, if you could just put in the comments below, if you're watching this live now as I'm streaming, let me know where you're from, where you're watching this from today. And if there's any sort of specific questions that you actually want me to answer today. So even if you're watching this webinar, later on, maybe you're seeing a recording of it, be really good idea if you still want to put in a comment below, because then we can come back and have a look at, comments and potentially look at answering those other questions. And if there's anything specific that you would like to know around this sort of area in terms of making sure that your organization can address these issues, then just please feel free to either put it in the comments, or you can send through an email to us, and we can have a look at what are the sorts of issues that you're experiencing in your everyday sort of working life. So I just going to sort of start our presentation here, and just let me know. I always laugh when I set these lights up, because it's kind of like they get onto my glasses and then I look like an alien. But what I'm going to do is just kind of give you some insight. We'll start here. Cool. So we've got somebody watching from Perth. So this is, fantastic that we can see people from all over the country. And I'm glad, 9 a.m, I think, over there. So we'll just kind of get into it if there's, like I said, any particular questions. So let me just start off by giving you this little bit of an insight. Where's it gone? Let me just go back. Look, how about I fix this for a second? It's always technology. I blame the technology. It's really the person who drives it. And it comes back to, me making sure that things work before we start, and then kind of forgetting to go back to the beginning. All right. But so here, this is a bit better, right? So we're going to be talking right now about preventing psychological injuries, specifically around bullying and harassment. Cool. Nice to see you, Cheryl. So Cheryl's watching from New Zealand. Tumut. That's not too far down the road from me. Nice that we're still having some nice warm weather, right? And hey, Ian, good to see you from Melbourne. So let's have a chat about some of these things. And as I said, if there's any comments along the way, I'll try and answer them as we go. But let's talk about why bullying and harassment tends to be a bit of a problem for people, and especially in the workplace. So we don't need to worry about those introductions. Thank you for introducing yourself and letting me know where you're watching from. So one of the things around mental health in general terms, right? So pre-COVID, we knew that 1 in 5 Australians on average would report having some level of psychological injury. So this is just in general in the population, right? This is not, but we're going to have those sort of numbers in the workplace as well, because if they're in the general population, they're usually similar numbers in your workplace. So what do we need to take away from that, though? With COVID, one of the things that happened was we've got a lot more people who are, noticing a level of psychological distress. And so we're now getting 4 in 5 Australians kind of saying, hey, I'm not sure that I'm handling everything very well, and I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed or stressed. And that can then lead in the longer term to developing some level of psychological problem. But when we start talking about workplace stuff, we've got psychological injuries that are arguably then caused by the work environment. And this is where the bullying and harassment elements come in. A lot of people, a lot of employers in particular, believe that, this is where the bulk of their psychological injury claims come from. But it's really interesting because the statistics show that it's actually poorly managed change. Now, where do they cross over and where are they different? For a lot of people, it's actually the change process that ends up being poorly managed, but people perceive that they're being bullied or harassed into doing something differently. And so they then perceive that it's a bullying and harassment issue rather than a poorly managed change issue. So that can be one of the areas that we need to kind of have a look at. But there are a few things that a lot of people don't really realize about when those psychological injuries, when the bullying and harassment stuff tends to be raising its ugly head. And interestingly, it's very early in the piece. So who am I to talk to you about all of this stuff? Well, I was once written up as Australia's most influential woman in mental health. I'm sure there are other influential people in mental health, but I think I tend to, talk about it a lot and talk about it a lot in these kind of forums. So I've also done a lot of work with different organisations and spend quite a bit of time trying to help you as employers actually improve the way that we manage our psychological challenges in the workplace in order to prevent them having to come and see somebody like me, right? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but there aren't very many psychologists available to people anymore. And it's a big issue. And our numbers have actually dropped a whole lot more since COVID. So for those, we've got, as a result of COVID, we've got more demand on psychology services, which is great because it actually kind of shows that people are a bit more aware that mental health is a bit of a problem, right? But on the flip side, we've actually not got a lot of available mental health resources in terms of mental health professionals. And this was something that the government became aware of. Like there was a report mid-2020 that actually talked about the fact that in this country, we have a burgeoning mental health crisis. And that was because of our workforce shortages. So it's a big problem, which is a big part of the reason why I try and help you to try and stop the injuries from developing in the workplace as much as we possibly can, because we spend the majority of our waking life as adults in our workplace. So when we kind of think about that, we spend more time at work usually than we do sleeping or with our families during the week anyway. And on weekends, sometimes we make up for that. But for a lot of people, it's a lot of time in the work environment, and therefore it can have quite a big influence. So where does the issue come in? Interestingly, there are a lot of bullying and harassment claims that usually come up within the first 3 months of something changing. So whether that's a new employee coming into a team, whether that's a new, so that could be a new younger employee, but that could also be a new boss, right? I've worked with organisations in the past where there's been a new senior manager and the way that they do things has been quite different. And that's actually meant that everybody underneath them has, taken exception to the information that this person's trying to gather from their work, and all kind of felt that they were being bullied and harassed. But one of the biggest issues around bullying and harassment, and we see this a lot in millennials, is we have a lot of awareness and familiarity around bullying and harassment now in our school system. So, young people are very familiar with the term. They understand that, you can't say nasty things to people and you can't do, and so if they feel that they're being unfairly targeted, then they'll, play that bullying and harassment card quite quickly. And the problem comes in that there's not a clear explanation when they're onboarded into a new role about what bullying and harassment actually is. And I can tell you that, WorkSafe Australia make a very clear distinction about what it is and what it isn't. And, when I work with organisations and we're looking at the onboarding kind of HR processes, what I really find a lot is that there's no clear kind of, nobody really tackles, well, what bullying and harassment is, and what we're going to talk about today, which is where that's documented, how we escalate it, how we communicate that escalation process, how we set up a system within our own organisation that provides for a mediating kind of supportive internal teams approach. So I'll often work with an organization that's, let's just say, medium size, where you've got, up to 100 employees, and you've got teams usually and the team leader. So I'll often train up the team leaders to actually mediate each other's teams. And the good thing about that is that you're building an internal capacity of this mentoring process that can then, be done for each other's teams, because the person who mediates it needs to be seen to be independent. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that mediation process kind of works. But a lot of what happens when we take on new staff is that we don't give those clear expectations, and we don't set them up when we onboard them. So when we often, and I say to people, you can't just give them the documentation to read, right? Because it's not enough. There has to be a conversation. There has to be a clear conversation in which we kind of talk about some of these things. I often think about the fact that these days when you go to a doctor, especially if you want to go to a specialist or whatever, they will step you through the process of anything that they think might make you uncomfortable. And this is what we need to do as employers. We need to step people through, even if they kind of go, oh, yeah, 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 yeah. You need to step them through. So this is what bullying is. This is what harassment is. This is when you feel that there might be a bullying or harassment issue going on. This is where the escalation process needs to be. When there's an escalation process, this is how we're going to handle it independently. This is how we ensure that you feel heard. These are the issues about performance over here, and these are the issues about, what's unreasonable and unfair. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is one of the things that I find, because businesses are very busy, and we often just assume that people are reading the, HR documents that we give them, that we don't actually sit down and step them through what bullying and harassment is, how we observe it, how we, react and respond to it, and how they can escalate. And that's why a lot of organizations find that they've got somebody gone off on stress leave before they even realize that there's a problem. And so it's a big issue. And it's just coming back to, how do we prepare people? Because the other thing about that is really important, is because why does a specialist do it? They do it so that they've got this confirmation. They can show people their documented process, and they'll usually have somebody else with them that witnesses the fact that we gave you this information ahead of time. And in doing that, we're providing this person with the assurance that we know that somebody has given them the information, and we can verify that it actually happened. And it's something that we think shouldn't be necessary in the workplace. We think, oh, it's all in the policies and stuff, and people, they're mature adults. But we see time and time again where it doesn't work. So a big part of this too is about setting up clear performance expectations. So we'll often give people, like, we interview them for the job, we'll give them their duty statement, we give them their KPIs, we kind of, just say there, and we'll have a review. And we don't really give them any clear kind of elements. I shouldn't say generally, but I know that a lot of times there's a lot of organizations, especially I notice in government sort of directed entities, where they kind of make them very loose, the KPIs, and people will do that so that they don't, they can kind of interpret whether or not it's been met. But that actually makes it quite difficult on the other side to then assess whether or not somebody's met it. So, if you've got a person at the front end whose job is to answer the phones, well, what's their KPI and their target? Well, it might be to answer the phones within a certain period of time, but then it's to make sure that they, accurately identify where those calls need to be transferred to or whatever, and that they do it in, a positive kind of customer service oriented way. When we're giving them a review of their performance in that, then we're going to look at a couple of metrics. We really do have an obligation to let them know what those metrics are ahead of time. Now, I had a recent case where an organisation had somebody who they'd employed to do outbound sales. And this company actually had the database, and they had this person that essentially they appointed account managers to different kind of, client groups, which is fair enough. The person who was the salesperson, they had KPIs and targets to meet, but they really took offense to the fact that the supervisor would randomly make calls to the varying client groups just to assess how the interactions were going. And this person said that that was bullying and harassment. But no, it's not, because this person who was doing the sales bit was kind of going, but that's my client. Well, actually, no, it's not. The client belongs to the company that they were employed to actually deliver the service to their client. So sometimes it's just an expectation setting that people don't spend enough time sort of in the onboarding process helping people to understand what the performance expectation is, and then how often that's going to be reviewed. What are the things that we use to assess it when it is reviewed, and how do we provide that feedback? On the flip side, I've actually seen it in other organizations where, it's really clear, like particularly in call centers, I find where it's really clear that this person's going to have their calls listened to, right? And there's dual sort of head setting that goes on. And, performance feedback is still done in a subjective way by the person who listens to the call. Now, if that's always couched in some sort of negative framework, then that person's going to feel like they are being harassed because this person doesn't give them any kind of positives in the feedback. So if you have a large organization in which something like that happened, you really need to be able to give the person who's doing the supervision or the dual head setting stuff some negative kind of what they have to pick up on in the negative, but also what they can give them as feedback in terms of the positive. Now, if you've seen any of the stuff that I've talked about before, I talk about the fact that feedback needs to go positive, negative, positive. And I'll talk about that in a second. We sometimes call it the shit sandwich. So you want them to hear what you're trying to kind of let them know is not working very well. They won't hear it unless you give them some positive stuff first. And if you finish it with a positive, it actually doesn't hurt them so much. So, and I'm just kind of looking, I'm going to move myself out of here for a second. The reason that we get a lot of people who talk about bullying more broadly is actually bullying really is unreasonable treatment. And that's the thing that a lot of people don't recognize, that bullying is not just me giving you feedback that you don't like or feedback that you find negative. If the feedback is actually relevant to your job, then the feedback is quite reasonable to be given, even if it is negative feedback, because you're trying to provide some information about how things could be improved. That's not bullying, actually. Bullying is unreasonable. So bullying has to be, somebody yelling at you and calling you an idiot or calling you, names or whatever. It's not bullying unless it's actually targeted directly to the person, or it's telling them that they're stupid because they did something wrong. That's still targeted at the person, but a lot of people would say, oh, I'm just telling them that what they did was stupid. No, you don't need to use stupid for a start. You just need to highlight that what they did wasn't right, remind them of the procedure, go back to this is about the procedure, not the person. So it's a process driven thing, right? So that's one of the things when we talk about, and I've got to find something better in terms of putting this together. So constructive feedback, right? So the constructive feedback needs to be about the person, like it's not about the person, it's about the work that they do. Okay, so this is where we sit there and we kind of go, constructive feedback needs to be given, but the constructive feedback just really needs to be clear that it is about the work. It's not about the person as an individual. So if they didn't do something correctly based on what their procedures that they're supposed to actually be, complying with, we need to give them the feedback about the work that they did, about the process that they followed, about why what they processed, what that process was, they didn't kind of, follow the step-by-step instructions, whatever it is, but it never should be about the person, because when it's about the person, that's when it turns into bullying or harassment. And if we start talking about the person being targeted or excluded, then it becomes more about the bullying and harassment. So feedback can be given, and I've actually seen this happen quite a bit, where a lot of people will talk about the fact that they get really worried about giving people feedback about their work performance because they're worried about getting called out for bullying. Now, it's really important to recognize that they are quite different processes. And, if it's really unreasonable, then it could be misconstrued as bullying. But part of why I talk about why you want to set up a mediating kind of culture within your organization is so that you can get that reality check around what's bullying and what's not. When it's about their, what their work is and what they're delivering on, and if they've missed something or whatever, it's about how we provide them that feedback and just how do we gently remind people, do you remember when I asked you to do blah, blah, blah? You missed something. That's okay. Can we just get on with doing it? We don't actually need to make it a really sort of negative process, if that makes sense. So I just want to kind of, highlight the fact that the constructive feedback is an important part, because it's an important part of people's training, right? So, and then we talk about improving engagement with people, and a lot of this is about how we communicate. So improving our engagement with staff members is a big part of being able to kind of, talk openly about some of the challenges that we might face, talking openly with people about, when they start a new role, what it was like. If you've got a number of new starters, and then, it might be a good idea to have one that's mentoring some of the others and talking about, when they first started, some of the challenges that they sort of experienced and how they overcame them, as opposed to just sort of leaving them in the tea room to get together and have a bit of a bitch fest about how they're not happy about something. And that's the other thing that I would encourage you to kind of pay particular attention to. Depending on the size of your organization, this is going to be easier for some and not so easy for others. But what's really important is being able to be, when you hear that there are things like that that are happening, it's kind of trying to nip those things in the bud before they kind of get any worse. Because if you have a number of people, or sometimes you'll get somebody in new who tends to kind of approach things in that way, and you want to just try and make it clear that we're trying to set up something that's very, proactive in our organization, and we really, we don't appreciate it just being, people whinging in the tea room without actually providing some sort of constructive feedback up the line. So it's kind of this reinforcement and the checking in. And I talk a little bit later about, making sure that you check in on a regular basis, doing that sort of pulse check. But communication is one of the big things that a lot of people get wrong, in the sense that they just don't provide enough communication about things in multiple formats. So we kind of think, oh, well, we've told them in a meeting. We don't then follow that up with an email that goes out, and we don't then give it to somebody. If you've got a change process, for example, we don't then tell the person who's actually responsible for the change that they need to set up regular communication elements too. And a lot of people kind of go, oh, nobody cares, nobody wants to listen anymore or whatever. But if you put that communication out, it means that if somebody comes along and then says, oh, I wasn't consulted about this, or, I didn't know that this was happening. It's kind of like, well, we had this meeting and we had all of these kind of emails that went out, and, we've given people these opportunities for feedback. What else could we have done to make sure that you were aware? Did you read the emails? Did you come to the meeting? Did you, because it's not about trying to catch people out. It's about trying to give people a sense of maybe their perception about their, role changing without them being engaged is just that. It's a misconception. And so we need to kind of go, well, I wonder why you feel that way, because these are all of the things that we did. If you didn't do them, that's different. But I think a lot of this is about how we manage that kind of perception. And then what do we do when we want to escalate issues? So when we onboard a staff member, it's really very important that we talk to them about, if they want to escalate an issue, well, what do they need to do about that? How do they do it? Who do they talk to? Give them the information, direct them to the documentation, give them a handout, whatever it is. But we need to make sure that when they want to escalate a problem, if they think they've got a problem, they need to know how they can escalate that. And that process for a lot of people, may be first going to the supervisor, because I see this a lot. The first port of call is to go to the supervisor. Now, yes, it is an important point, but if they feel that the supervisor is the one that's causing the problem, or the supervisor is the one that they've got a misconception about potentially, then there has to be an escalation point above that where they feel that they can actually at least say this is how they feel. Now, I get it. A lot of supervisors will kind of go, well, you can't exclude me from the process. But what I always say is rather than there being a one-on-one conversation about a problem, always turn that into a three-way conversation. So if a person escalates an issue to you, right, and you're like, there's a supervisor above them and you're the one above that, right? So you want to be able to give them a process that says you're hearing them, and there's an element of that, that you want them to give you the information. And then you need to facilitate a three-way mediated conversation. And that's because we want to get it out on the table in front of both people. So don't do it separately, because it's one of the problems that we end up with, because then this one feels like that one's talking behind their back and that one talks like this one. So it doesn't work. You really are better off if they feel they can't talk to their supervisor and then they want to go above, give them an escalation that goes above, but that has to be set up with a couple of different things. Okay, so one, when it goes above, you want to know why they didn't feel that they could speak to the supervisor directly. What's their experience that shows that that person's not able to hear them or give them reasonable feedback on it? And then the second one is then letting that person know that in doing that escalation, that's fine, but that there will be a three-way conversation, because it needs to be done that way. Because if there's no three-way, a lot of people will kind of go, oh, I don't want them to know, but actually that's not reasonable, right? As human beings, reasonable adults, we can sit and we can have a conversation. And if we actually learn how to do basic mediation, you can hear both sides, and you don't have to actually take sides. You just need to facilitate this communication process, because it's the communication process breakdown that causes the problem. And so there's lots of reasons for why that can be, but we just need to, don't automatically assume that because there is a new staff member and you've worked with this supervisor for 10 years, that the problem is the new person. It just might be something about the standards of communication in that sort of manager person that, this person's not ever had to deal with before, and they just need some, facilitated conversation or process. So the next thing is to make sure that your documentation is clear and consistent. And it's one of the problems that I find a lot. A big organization in particular. So there'll be updated bits of information, or they'll have really high level kind of, motherhood statements about how we treat each other with respect and blah, blah, blah. But there's not really underneath it any kind of clear actions or links necessarily to help people understand, what's reasonable and what's not. And, where the documentation needs to be really clear and consistent is understanding that, these are the processes that we have in place. These are the expectations around performance. If there is a problem, here is where you go to escalate the problem. This is the things that we need you to tell us when you escalate the problem about, if you can't go to this person, what it is, or if you went to that person and this was the outcome, what that was. And please understand that even if you haven't been able to talk to that person about this, when you come to this point, we will facilitate and mediate a process by which we can resolve it, because that's what human beings do. That's what we need to be able to do as reasonable adults in all of that. So hopefully that all makes sense. And I know a lot of you will feel like you do have documentation in place and people, are told to read it from the beginning. But unless you actually step people through some of this sort of stuff, you can't, especially around the bullying and harassment stuff. If you don't want to have long ongoing issues into the future, making sure that when you onboard people, you make a point of talking about these things really does make a big difference in terms of them knowing what the expectation is and where they go for help if they're feeling that, it's not quite the way that they thought it should be. Okay, so stress management, because what are we talking about? When we're talking about bullying and harassment, often what we're talking about are stressed staff. So when we talk about, our staff being stressed, and we can recognize that the stress can come from within the organization, or it might come from external to the organization. So the stress is not always going to be just about the work. It might be, but you might have somebody, a staff member, who comes to you and tells you that they're going through a divorce, their relationship's broken down, that they've got these other personal problems. Then we know that that person's going to be stressed. And so stress management in the workplace requires a plan. There might be a private conversation between a person who's got a personal issue and their supervisor. But if that's an ongoing issue, that needs to also be communicated by the supervisor to the rest of the team. Otherwise, the team are going to feel that this person's getting some sort of special treatment, right? I'm just going to have a quick drink. It's one of the things that we don't often manage very well. So it's making sure that we help people understand that when we have stress, that we have natural kind of reactions and things that we do. Some people will then go to the avoidance. If you notice that somebody seems to have been stressed or concerned, and then next thing you know, they're off on some sort of leave, it might be stress leave, but it might have been something else. You need to actually intervene to look at addressing the misunderstanding. And this is one of the things that kind of happens a lot when we see, because what's happened over the years is a lot of companies have got a bit paranoid actually about, talking to people about leave, or talking to people about stress, or talking to people about, if they're feeling hassled or whatever, the pressures of work. When people actually go off on stress leave of some sort and they've got a medical certificate, a lot of people then kind of go, oh, I can't talk to them and I can't find out what's going on or whatever. But on the flip side, usually the person who's off on stress leave, if nobody kind of reaches out to them, then their stress leave just prolongs. They just stay off on leave because they can't deal with it. If the person, if you were aware, just as an example, that it was the supervisor that there was a bit of an issue, and you're the next level above, and you actually reach out to them and kind of go, hey, I just wanted to check in on you because I understand that you've been quite stressed recently. I was a bit worried when I heard you were off on stress leave. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to support you or help you, come back into the work environment? If they tell you then that there is a big problem with this direct supervisor in some way, if there is any possibility within your organization to kind of take that person and move them sideways until you've worked out what's going on, unless you already know, obviously, then, the best place for them to be is actually at work. Because even if they feel that they've got a problem with this person, if they go off on a couple of days stress leave and they come back in and they're back in exactly the same role or whatever, then sometimes those problems just kind of escalate and they feel more pressured by, this supervisor, whoever they were having issues with. So a big part of this is recognizing that the avoidance is where they get to when they don't feel that they've been heard and they don't feel like they can cope with this anymore. So if there's any opportunity for you to make them feel like they're still valued and you value them to your organization, you can address the misunderstanding. And if that means you give them, a special project for a while, it doesn't matter. It's actually better to give them something that's, off to the side than to turn around and have them not at work at all, because then you're not getting any productivity from them in any way, shape or form. And if we don't address that early, then they end up often putting in some level of claim and, moving forward from there. So it's trying to notice when those things happen. Now, I talk about the judgment. And the reason that I kind of highlight this is because when somebody goes off on stress leave, they've usually got a skewed perception of how either they're being judged or, they may be judging the other person, and it's often a two-way street, of course. So one of the things about this is about setting the scene of that reality check, right? The reality check needs to be, this person kind of says, oh, this person's mean and they're doing these nasty things or whatever. And you have to be able to really do this from a very impartial perspective where you kind of go, oh, so what is it about that person in terms of, the way that they've interacted with you that makes you feel that way? Because I'm sorry to hear that that's the way you feel. And let's reality check. what is the situation? And even if what they say to you seems to be a little bit over the top, then what you can actually say at that point is, I'm really like, acknowledge the pain first. I'm really sorry to hear that you feel that way. Just saying sorry that you acknowledge they feel that way is not saying sorry that that person has actually done something wrong, right? Now, this is a really important point to come back to, because we often do it where we won't say sorry because we think that we're apologizing for something that we've done wrong or the company's done wrong or whatever. When we can say, I'm sorry that you feel that way, right? We're acknowledging their pain. And I talk about this a lot. It's, that sorry is not the acknowledgement, like it's not the acceptance of the liability, right? But especially in Australian culture, we take it as this, liability issue. It's not that. It's actually just acknowledging that you're sorry that's the way that they feel, right? And there's a very big distinction between that. But what you want to do is then unpack why they feel that way. Now, for a lot of people, they kind of go, oh, this just seems like too much effort and it's just really hard. And why can't this person just pull their head in and get on with their work? Well, yep, I understand, but it depends on the kind of people that you've got working for you and some of the challenges that they may or may not bring. Different areas for different reasons. You'll find, they have a bit of a, I don't know, sometimes you'll employ a few people in a particular area and, they have a bit of a kind of bitchy, backbiting culture. And I've seen it. You walk into some places, you kind of go, wow, like there is just this sense of, the constant backbiting in the tea room is almost something they've done for so long, they don't even realize that's what they're doing, right? So by mentoring in a level of a mediating kind of culture, and, I've done this with organizations where it's really, you've got to go to the top. If somebody comes to you whinging about somebody, you need to be able to call that out and go, okay, so I'm sorry to hear that. Let's go and talk about it. Let's have a meeting. Let's see if we can work this out. And by setting that up, what you're doing is clearly saying to people that we don't just do these two-way conversations that other people don't get to know about, or then those people would be completely blindsided, not knowing that these people were whinging about the way they did something behind their back. And it's a really hard thing for people to do often, is this sense of, oh, I just don't want to, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to make waves. I don't want to upset anybody. But actually, by not addressing the issue of the way people are speaking about somebody else in the work environment, there's almost an underlying encouragement of that kind of backbiting behavior, right? And it's just not acceptable in the workplace. That sense of, bitching about somebody behind their back's just not an acceptable thing to do in a modern work environment, because that is the stuff that people can perceive as, bullying and harassment, and it can be a bit rude. And look, I get it that, some people kind of go, oh, sometimes I just need to blow off steam. Yeah, but if you're constantly blowing off steam about the same supervisor in the same tea room day in, day out, and that supervisor is not actually given the information that this is how they're making other people feel, it's not a reasonable thing to do, right? It's not somebody at some point actually has to do what they can to provide some feedback so that this person can either take a different approach, or this group of people that thinks that it was okay to kind of, get together and gang up on this other one, are kind of like they're told that that's not an okay thing. Right. So a lot of the stuff that we end up with in these confusing spaces is an awful lot about the fact that we get people who just feel uncomfortable about addressing some of these challenges in the workplace. Smaller your workplace is, actually the easier it is to do, because you've got consistency. But the bigger the organization grows, the more challenging it is to actually get these things out in the open. So I talk about, this is the framework I talk about how we manage our emotional responses. And I talk about this in my book, In the Trouble with Trauma. This is the self-management system. We talk about the fact that this can help individuals understand themselves and position themselves in the organization if they're feeling, upset about something, it just helps them to kind of position themselves and also see where the other person might be. So it's part of some of the training that I've done with organizations, just to help people understand where they're at when they're kind of feeling a particular, they might be angry or they might be feeling sad or withdrawn in the workplace. It helps them to kind of put themselves in that map and go, oh, so what am I feeling and what triggered that? And it really does help a lot of, when I do that with teams in particular, it helps the teams to really kind of be able to work better together, because they can see how they're reacting and how the other person's sort of reacted, and they can work a way to move it forward to come to a more rational solution. So acknowledging the pain, as I said before, whether that's a personal or a workplace pain, is actually really quite important. And that's why I say that sorry is not the admission of liability. It's just the acknowledgement of another person's pain. And when we acknowledge pain, we make people feel a lot better. So, when we talk about people who we have, like, we know that they've got challenges, right? So you've got staff members who have had some mental health stuff because they've disclosed it. We then have to work out a way, how do we support those vulnerable kind of members of staff? And this is where there's some recent research came out last week, actually, Frontline Mental Health Conference. There was a presentation given around the fact that we talk about it like the leadership lottery. It basically says that your outcomes in terms of, how you're treated in the work environment when you've got, potentially a psychological issue looming, that your outcome is directly mediated by the leader. So when we talk about, I often do mental health literacy with managers, because at that management level, especially the lower level managers, and I want to say like team leaders and stuff, where this is almost like their first supervisory role, they often get promoted to those supervisory roles because they are competent in the technical proficiency of whatever that team does. So I was talking to an organization that's a technology development company. What they find was, they often would have the person wanting to become a team leader who is the most developmentally technically proficient. And they worked out that that just doesn't work, that the person who's the really great technology developer really doesn't necessarily have the people skills to manage all of the other elements that come into managing people. So they end up setting up this sort of secondary tier where a developer ends up being promoted. They kind of become this technical lead, but to the side of that, they actually have somebody who's got specialty kind of people skills, who is arguably the team leader for all of them, because that's the people person. You need the people person to look after the people. You need the technically proficient person to help guide them on the technical proficiency of things. They don't necessarily go together, but the way that we work in Australia is often that person gets just promoted to the team leader because that's seen to be the promotion point. And really, it shouldn't be, because when we're managing other people, that's a very different set of skills, right? And the mental health literacy of the manager is one of the things that we often struggle with, and we see it's not blanket across the organization. A lot of people get promoted without being given any people training either. So that's another problem we've got to make sure that we address. So you'll remember I said earlier about how you maintain connection to the people in your organization and doing that internal pulse check. The larger the organization, the more challenging this becomes, right? But if you can get the senior leaders to set it up. I remember at one point, this was years ago, I worked in an organization where the most sort of senior leader would have a lunchbox every month where people from different teams could kind of, put their hand up, go and have lunch with the CEO. And it was just an open conversation about stuff. The staff would put their hand up about where they were coming from and, maybe what they wanted to have a chat about. And, from there'd be a dozen people and you'd turn up for lunch and, it was just an open chat. And it's a really useful way to help people kind of get an idea about what's going on in their organization. A lot of people will talk about the fact that a lot of places will have an EAP program. Somebody's a bit stressed or having a bit of a problem. Oh, we've got the EAP, we refer them off to the EAP. But I can tell you that external early intervention is actually too late. the person's already developed the problem, the person's already developed some level of bias or perceived bias about how they're being treated. So once we get to this point, we've already got a looming workers' comp claim, right? I mean, the EAP can be there because people have got personal problems and, their employer wants to help them. That's different. But if there's an issue and we just kind of just go and talk to that person out there, there's a couple of problems with that. One, the external service provider has no idea about your internal culture. They've got no awareness around, what's really going on. They may validate this person's experience. And in my opinion, what usually happens is the person's presenting them with a particular perspective on what's happened. And of course, the therapist is just going to support and back that person's perspective. That's what the therapist's job is. That's not going to help you if that's actually going to create a bigger divide between your staff members because they've got an issue. This person going and talking to an external therapist who's got no awareness of your organization is actually probably going to make that divide even bigger. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have EAP services available, but if we better managed internally our mental health sort of challenges because we were on top of them with our HR kind of processes and approach, then we wouldn't kind of need them in the same way because actually at that point, often the damage has been done. So it's a really important sort of thing to be aware of. Don't just expect that you can send them to the external provider and everything will be fine. When I'm talking to, bigger organizations, we look at the multi-stage framework that we need to put in place, which is looking at that promotion activities is creating awareness around mental health stuff. We need to look at the prevention activities to help people understand, when people have got issues in the workplace, how do we intervene early to stop it causing a bigger problem? And then the early intervention is if you do need to send them off to an external provider, that is there, but it's not the only thing. Most places actually just rely on the EAP or the early intervention external stuff to resolve their issue. So I talk a lot about recovery at work. And the 3 keys around that recovery at work is the ability to be able to have some awareness of the problem. So it's helping people to be aware of when a problem is a problem. And that's why I talk about, what bullying and harassment really is, what performance management actually is, what the performance expectation requirements kind of are, and how we check in on that, being really clear about what that is. There's the awareness element of it. And then there's the validation when somebody's telling you that they've got a problem. So we validate the fact that they feel that way. We're not taking sides, remember? We're just kind of going, I'm really sorry that you feel that way. But you're a really valuable person to this organization. We've spent lots of time and effort and money training you, and we don't really want to lose that, that expertise or that whatever you bring to the table kind of thing, right? And then there has to be a sense of purpose for them to be able to move forward. They don't just assume that just because they've got a bit of a problem with somebody that they're always just going to be a problem. And it can be one of those things that we develop perceptions about people if they come in brand new, for example, and the person that they've got a concern about is somebody who's been around for 5 years and a great performer. But, just because they've been around for a long time and they're technically very proficient doesn't necessarily mean that they have great people skills that can adapt to everybody. We need to kind of spend some time understanding what the problem really is. All right. So if you're watching and you still kind of, still with me in the comments, be really great if you would just put in the comments for me one of the things that you may have found helpful about the things that I've just kind of shared with you. If there's anything that you found useful, if there's anything that you kind of hadn't thought about before, maybe whether, there's something that, you had assumed coming into this that I might talk about, maybe I haven't covered. And so if you have anything that you would like me to address right now is definitely the time to, type away those quick fingers, and that will kind of come through and I should be able to sort of see any of those comments. Because it's really kind of difficult when we start doing these, webinars where it's just sort of one way. I do like to make sure that everything that you're hearing and everything that I'm talking about is something that, you found useful or helpful. So if you end up coming back to watch this a bit later and you feel like, that's too late, I can't put my comments in. Please don't think that. Put the comments in, because we do actually come back and have a look at those comments and just sort of see what people found helpful, what wasn't helpful, what were the things that you were hoping I would cover that I haven't covered, and just making sure that because, these take quite a lot of time. We don't want to turn around and put things out that, you just sort of sitting there going, oh, ho hum, that was really boring. I'm sure there are things that I could do with my time, and so could you. So I don't want to bore you to tears. Just, while people are thinking about that, there's some other training for managers that we have up on the website looking at addressing psychosocial challenges in the workplace. There's a lot of bespoke stuff that we need to do for organizations that, I can help you with if there's a specific thing that you want to do, and we can develop a particular kind of training program. What I often like to do is talk to people about what they perceive their issue actually is and what they need to address it. And we often then work with that and build into it. So Anthony's just saying, reinforcing the way to deliver constructive criticism is to start and end with positives, making that conversation more effective. It is a really big thing, Anthony, that a lot of people just don't realize. And it's so simple. So, you've got to give somebody negative feedback because they haven't done the right thing. And I find this is particularly important if you're aware that there's something they're consistently not doing right. When you're with them on the job, and I don't know why, but I often think about, there was a plumber that I knew who he said, he was having a bit of an issue with the new apprentice. And it showed him how to, install toilet, did number one, did number two. They had 300 toilets they had to put in. Done number one, showed him again number two. Number three really sort of stepped him through it and asked him to give him a hand. Number four, did the reverse, got him to do most of it with direction. Number five, basically got him to do it while he sort of watched and give a bit more direction. Number six, left him to it. And, where it's taken an hour or so before that, then the last one took the apprentice 3 hours or whatever, which is okay. It's just time. But when he came back, he called him back because he went, after number six, then he went, I don't know how to do it anymore. I can't remember. And so he was going, I just, do the same thing as before, and the young guy got really kind of flustered and then said, no, I can't do it. And basically called his mum and walked off the job. And it's really hard because, instead of kind of going, okay, so, and I said to him, how did you approach it? And he said, I just sort of said to him, oh, come on, mate, you just put one in, you know how to do it. But if he kind of said, oh, you did a great job on the last one. I can see that you took your time and you really thought about it. So if we start again from that beginning bit, where are you finding it's a little, where's the first bit that you get stuck, right? The approach is much gentler. And it's one of the things that can be, it doesn't seem like much. And I often say in the trades, it's one of those areas that's really challenging because you're just kind of like, oh, man, I haven't got a lot of time for this. But that young guy ended up walking off the job and mum picked him up and never to be seen again. And I hear this a lot, particularly in those sort of trade sectors. So anyway, important. All right. Ian's just saying that it's good to emphasize the importance of providing both the positive as well as the negative feedback if the negative is applicable. And look, especially when somebody's learning new, there is negative going to happen. You have to give them the feedback that says, okay, you didn't quite follow the process. We're going to do this bit, right? And I just think that if we don't do that, we're not actually setting up the reality. We have to give those feedback elements, but we're trying to pick up on, you did this really good. When you're going to do this next time, just try and focus on these, this detail, this detail. It doesn't all have to be, oh, you screwed this up. It's just kind of like, just remember to go back to the checklist and blah, 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 blah. And then, and I'm sure you'll be fine. And, give me a yell if you need anything, whatever. Young people these days, I say to people, if you've got to show them something physically that they've got to do, get them to video you while you're showing them. It sounds stupid, but young people are so driven by watching YouTube and learning stuff, right, that they really respond quite well to it. All right. So how do we build resilience in our people? And this is where I talk about mental muscle method for teams. So I will work with an organization sometimes on, working with the whole team over a longer period of time to actually build some sort of strengths and resilience into those people, particularly if your workforce is quite young, then, that's something that you might want to think about. When we talk about resilience building in people, what we end up with is this sense of, improved flexibility, enhanced focus for them, that they've got some level of sort of mental endurance or strength, and that they get that increased endurance. So their ability to be able to do things in the workplace and stick at them for longer is often what we see when we start talking about building that sort of, psychological resilience and what I call mental strength. And it's not just harden up. Really, it's not, that doesn't work. It's actually about trying to help people. A lot of it's about problem solving, because young people in particular these days, we've sort of raised our children in an environment where we've been busy, so we don't actually teach them how to problem solve. We usually just step in as parents and fix it for them. And it's quite a disenfranchising kind of process, and we've ultimately left it to people not to know how to resolve problems, and it is a big issue. In case you haven't seen it, if you're in a HR area or you're in a senior management role, I would encourage you to go and have a look at this psych injury prevention area. We do a scorecard for organisations to assess the psychological injury risk that your organisation might be exposed to. Don't worry if you can't remember that whole big URL. If you go to the main website, which is the kerryhoward.com.au, you'll find that link to the scorecard assessment is there. So if you do that, what you need to understand is that there are 5 result areas that it produces for you, and they actually align with the Black Dog Institute report that came out in October last year around modern work and how changes to the way we work are impacting Australians' mental health. So in that report, they produced 5 keys for business. And interestingly, they produced that after I'd already done the psych injury prevention stuff, but they come out with the same 5 areas. So they talk about training your leaders, which is where I talk about your people, empowering your people, which is where I talk about your HR processes, intervening early, which is where I talk about prevention activities. What they talk about prevention is actually where I talk about how we manage change, because they're talking about the areas that we need to prevent, and change, as I said, is the number one area that causes problems usually. And then they talk about transition. I just refer to it as agility. So it's how flexible your organization is in terms of how they change things over time. So my challenge to you for 2022 is, how do you create a psychologically healthy workplace? And, if there's anything that you would like to hear more about from me that I can help you with making sure that your psychologically healthy workplace happens in 2022, please reach out and let me know. The reason that I find this really valuable work to do is because, as I said, I don't need more people coming individually in the front door. It's more about how do we help you in your business actually prevent these things from causing a bigger issue for your workplace. So just remembering too that it's 4 in 5 people that report issues since COVID. It could be you, it could be your boss, it could be off-site staff, it could be peers, it could be stakeholders, it could be your partner, it could be anybody. And understanding that it's now, the majority rather than the minority that it was before is something that I think is a really important point that people should, try and come back to. All right. Want to know more? You can grab a copy. So The Trouble with Trauma is a book that I brought out at the end of 2020 because I was trying to help more people to help themselves. A really important thing to try and give people a sense of empowerment about understanding themselves. And we often don't identify that trauma is, we don't naturally think that trauma is the basis of our problems, but it actually, traumatic experiences are at the basis of all of what we call our psychopathology. So our mental health issues develop because of our traumatic experiences. It's just that the way that we often talk about trauma in the community is like, oh, it has to be a car accident or, something big. Whereas we have traumatic experiences throughout our whole lives. It's just usually how we approach them and what we're telling ourselves about when they're happening at the time, about whether or not it stays as a traumatic injury causing problem or not. Now, New book. So I am in the process of actually doing interviews for this new book. I'm interviewing senior managers who are working in different sectors, and I'm actually then interviewing also people who have been injured at work in those different sectors, and looking at what's the trouble with trauma at work, because it's one of the biggest areas that we know where we kind of have these injuries that come up and they're not well managed, and we want to try and make it work much better than it does now. So any particular questions before we finish up, you can put them in the comments below. I think it's, great that a few people have given some feedback about, the things that they've seen along the way. But if there's any specific questions that you have, please feel free to put them into the comments. And again, like I said, we'll come back to them a bit later. If you need any more information, please just have a look on the kerryhoward.com.au. If you have a look through the LinkedIn feed, there's a lot of different videos and snippets of things that might be there that can help you. But you could go to the website and find the links to the preventing sort of psychological injury, the app that you can go and sort of do that assessment for your organisation into the future. But thank you for spending your lunchtime with me today. And next month we'll be running another prevention focused webinar. And because I really want to talk about prevention a lot, it helps people to understand that there are things that we can do that make it better for everybody, really. All right. So in lieu of any particular questions coming up right now, I'd like to say thank you again for joining me, and I will see you soon.